And welcome once again to Ewtn's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host, with our guest author, Katie Peterson Warner. And the book is Head and Heart, Becoming Spiritual Leaders for Your Family. And welcome here to Ewtn's Bookmark. It's great to have you. I'll say Katie Warner here.
Great to be here.
Katie, now with the last name, the middle name there, Peterson, that's
right.
A family name, and a lot of people would know your dad, right?
Right, yes, Tom Peterson of Catholics Come Home. So I'm actually the manager of communication and evangelization for Catholics Come Home. Ewtn viewers probably know us from our television commercials that we run to help invite people home to the church.
Right, that have been run on major networks during major football games, as well as the series.
Football games during Christmas, we run our Santa's Priority commercial, teaching people to keep, Jesus at the center of the season. And also during the papal visit, we ran our epic ads to just inviting people home to the church and to learn more about the Catholic faith when the Pope's here and all of the news of his visit is going on, to show people, this is what the Catholic Church is all about.
Right, yeah, when the Pope visited back in September. Right. And of course, we also have the idea that there's a series, Catholics Come Home, that have been on Ewtn, 2 sets of series really that we'll have that your dad already worked on as well. So let's talk about this. Is this your first book then?
This is my first book.
Okay, but you've been a writer, right? You've done some blogging and things like that,
I write for the National Catholic Register. I'm a correspondent. Okay. And write for the Integrated Catholic Life, a wonderful website that compiles all sorts of great articles. And then I've done a number of other programs and different ministry work. Symbolon, the Augustine Institute Symbolon program, Opening the Word. So I've definitely had my hand in a lot of different ministry activities. But this kind of came about just, about a year ago, and was just really on my heart, and God presented an opportunity, and I felt like there was really a need for.
Have you always liked to write? I mean, I know in the book you talk about the fact that you want to do more writing. Right.
I've always loved to write. I've always loved to speak and just share my faith with people, whether in written or spoken word. But it was really my husband that was the catalyst for this book. I hadn't planned on writing a book.
You said that in the beginning.
Right. I was very happy writing articles, and a conversation that we had on the way home from Holy Thursday Mass one day really led to this book. He just opened up to me saying that he really wanted to be a strong spiritual leader for our family, wanted to be the strong spiritual head of our home, but he just didn't really know what that would look like. And so he just said to me, I need a resource. Like, I'd love some sort of guide to just show me, here's what you can do to really bring the Catholic faith in a vibrant way into your family and lead your family toward heaven. And so I went looking for that resource, and I really couldn't easily find what I was looking for. So I just felt, okay, maybe this is God saying, well, why don't you put it together? So that's kind of what started me on this road to writing Head and Heart.
But you're his wife. Obviously, he's going to open up to you. Now, you grew up, obviously, with your parents. Obviously, your parents have had a strong faith, and your dad has stepped out in faith over these years. So did your husband, or did your understanding of that kind of spiritual leadership, did you have that because you saw that in your dad? Right.
I definitely grew up in a home that had, I had a very strong spiritual head, as I call the, man and husband and father of the family. And my mom was such a strong spiritual heart of our family, one of the most prayerful and patient and just devout, Catholic women that I know. And so I had that example growing up. And my husband also grew up a practicing Catholic, going to Mass every Sunday. His parents encouraged them to go on youth retreats and get involved in ministry. But I also had the, advantage of being able to get my degree in Catholic theology and just be around so many Catholic families who were really, living, the faith strongly in their homes, being spiritual leaders for their families, and seeing how they were, taking all of this, catechetical theological knowledge that they had of the Catholic faith and applying it in a very practical day-to-day way with their families at home in the midst of modern, busy family life. And so that was kind of what set me on a journey to interview. I interviewed, about 4 dozen different men, women, and couples. Exactly, to share their stories, but then also to reflect on church teaching, how that relates, bring in the wisdom of Scripture, and then come up with, what I call action steps. So now that we know, these characteristics that make up strong spiritual leaders, how can we apply that in a practical way right now at home, in whatever age or stage we are in our family life?
Okay. Well, in the beginning, you've got Bishop Connolly of the Diocese of Lincoln, a great friend of Ewtn. He starts with, we are created for family life. And you think about today, it's totally under attack. He says, in civil law, the family is being radically redefined, gutted of its basic meaning, its divinely revealed purpose. Marriage has lost its meaning for many people, becoming a kind of cultural endorsement for social relationships instead of a lifelong partnership oriented to the procreation, education of children. And that's the thing too, because you were even describing the fact you grew up in that kind of a home. You saw it in other Catholic families, but there's a lot of people out there who don't see that. They didn't see that in their family, or they don't see it in other families around them.
Right. Or even if they do, even if they did grow up in a family like that, I know that, most of us want even more for our families, and then we want our children to go on and have even more vibrant Catholic homes in their families. And so one of the things that Bishop Conley did a beautiful job of in the foreword was just showing that the family is, just like St. John Paul II said, the vital cell of society. So if we can renew family culture, if we can start one family at a time, being more intentional with how we're living the Catholic faith in our own home, then that has a ripple effect on the families in our parish, in our community, and then eventually on the world. So in a time when really marriage and family is so under attack, this is the absolutely right time to be saying, okay, well, let's raise up stronger spiritual leaders in the home so that they can start affecting the communities around them.
Right. Parents must witness to the durability and fidelity of marriage when those values have been lost. Parents must celebrate virtue when license has become de rigueur. So that's the thing too. I think you're dealing with a lot of us baby boomers who came out of the 60s and things like that, and the idea of self-actualization and being happy and doing what you think is best for you personally, rather than that kind of lifelong ingrafting in a marriage relationship is not the way people see things many times today. And so it's difficult, especially when today at different times, it's tough to really know, well, what is the church teaching? At least a lot of people feel like that. But you talk about the resources that really you should go to, right?
Right, and there was actually a 60-year-old gentleman who contacted me, and after he had read the book and said, man, I wish this was around when I was raising a family. I just didn't have those resources to turn to, the stories of what other couples were doing to live the faith in the home. I think so many of us can go to our parish and get involved in ministry, and we know how to live our Catholic faith when we're outside the home. But what about when we're at home? What does prayer life look like for an average family just going about their busy life? Maybe they don't have hours to sit in the adoration chapel because they're raising toddlers, or they're going through something else in their family life that makes prayer kind of something that they have to really learn. How do I make this a priority in my life amidst all of my other commitments? Or maybe like I said, when our culture is so under attack with marriage, what can I do on a regular basis to strengthen my own marriage? Because that's one of the greatest things we can do, to witness to the power of and the beauty of a marriage between one man and one woman, is to show how our own marriage is a reflection of what God intended marriage to be. So what are some things that we can do at home right now, to strengthen our marriage? Or we also talk in the book about, how do we learn how to suffer with purpose, or to cultivate peace in our homes? Peace isn't something that I think many of us think is something, right? Yeah. Peace is something that I feel like we don't think is possible in our culture today. We have, packed calendars, and we're constantly listening to noise, and we're sitting in traffic jams. How could I possibly have a home that's full of peace? So in that chapter we talk about things like honoring the Lord's Day. How many of us really kind of allow work, chores and different activities to crowd our Sunday and not take that time for worship and family time. That alone can drastically transform your family and the amount of peace that's in your home and in your heart and in your marriage.
In the beginning here, the acknowledgement, she said it was exciting to watch the Holy Spirit work throughout the brainstorming, writing, and editing phases of this book. So how long did it actually take you from that brainstorming phase to getting the book written?
So, Holy Thursday was of, I think it was 2013, or 2014, was the conversation that made me initially start thinking about it. And then it was actually the next week that I was on the phone with someone from Emmaus Road Publishing who had previously been interested in publishing a book of mine, but I didn't really have one in mind. And so I had signed a contract by that summer, and then just started writing away. My little boy was very early in his life at that time, so during his nap time, I'd strap him on. Yeah, I call him my co-author. Yes, my little son RJ. I'd strap him into my little carrier, and during his naps, I'd type away. So it took about 8 months to write the book, and we were hoping to release it in time, which we did for the World Meeting of Families and the Synod of the Family, because this is such a perfect way to take what we've heard from the Pope when during his visit to the U.S. and just everything that the Church has been talking about families, and then to actually kind of boots on the ground apply that at home. This is what we can do as lay people to take all of that beautiful knowledge that we now have about what we should be doing in our families today and apply that in our own lives.
In the beginning here, you have how to use this book. Was that your idea to include something like that, to say how to use this book? Was that something Emmaus Road came in and said, looking at the book, we'd like to have something like that in there?
It was actually something that came about in the process of my writing it. I started learning things like, if you were to read this book from cover to cover, that's great, but if you really want to get the full impact out of it, you might want to go and then start taking it in chunks, one chapter at a time. Let me really work on having a stronger marriage. Let's my husband and I, or my wife and I, really work this month on things we can do to improve our marriage. And then you move on to the next characteristic. And so, there are things like that talk about adopting, strategies incrementally. I'm the kind of person that wants to wake up tomorrow and be a saint, but sanctity takes time. So to remember that God takes pleasure to see you take your little steps. That's a quote from St. Francis de Sales.
So that's why stress is the thing you work on.
Right, exactly. Peace, yes, I say yes. That's my number one characteristic that I try to work on. And then also, one of the things that I realized as I was writing this is, as great as this book is for individuals to read at home or couples to read at home together, it's also really fantastic to do as a group, at your parish, whether that's in a men's group, a women's group, a marriage ministry, marriage prep, to be able to work, in a parish setting with this book, to really kind of bounce ideas off of other couples and have that support system going through it with other families who also want to grow in their Catholic faith.
You say that this is an ideas book. What do you mean when you say this is an ideas book?
So one of the things when I was interviewing other couples is I was very aware of how different, the expression of the Catholic faith is at home in different families. So, there are people in this book who have no kids, some people who have, huge families, a dozen kids, and then everywhere in between. And some, I also talked to some people who don't have children or who are older in their family life. All their children are grown and out of the house. And so they all offer these different ideas of how they incorporate these leadership characteristics into their home. And so I really wanted the reader to know that these are great ideas to try, but also do what works for your family. Every family is different. And so I think God really loves that He's infused in us just different personalities and gifts, and wants us to use those unique traits in our own homes.
That
to kind
complementarity.
of, exactly, to express our faith in a way that's unique to our family.
Right, exactly. There's not one-stop way to do everything, cookie-cutter way of doing it. It doesn't work that way. That's why you go to say this book is good if you do it as a team, obviously, as a couple, and also the idea of adopting strategies incrementally, It says, identify yourself as a spiritual leader. How does one do that?
Right. So I think most of us, when we think about leaders or leadership, we think about our boss at work, or the president, or somebody with a management title, or who holds a lofty position, or something like that. But really what I wanted to do was reframe our thinking of leadership. And as Christians, we really look to Christ as the epitome of a leader. And so when we look at Christ's leadership, what we see is not the kind of leadership that we may be most familiar with thinking about in our modern culture. We see a servant leader. So one of the things that I wanted to do in this book was really show, this is what spiritual leadership is at home. It's servant leadership, and all of us are called to it. When we enter the vocation of marriage and family life.
We hear that, servant leadership. What does that mean?
Exactly. So, so when we look at the way that Christ led, He didn't really lead with He didn't have a lofty title, at least not an earthly one. And He really served other people through humble, just submission. He was there to really just help build other people up in faith and in love of Him, to call people to a relationship with Him. And so when I talk about becoming spiritual leaders for your family, it's less about the kind of influence that you're exerting on people, and more about ushering the people you love into a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ, and more about becoming the person that God made you to be, the spiritual head or the spiritual heart of your family that God created you to be, so that you can help draw everybody else in your family closer to the person that God's calling them to be. So one of the perfect examples that I think of is the Martin family. We look at Saint Therese of Lisieux, and then her parents talk about, they're the first married saints to be canonized together in history, at fall of 2015. And what a beautiful witness they are to showing what holy family life is meant to be. When they were pursuing their own sanctity, when they were trying to become the best spiritual head and spiritual heart of their family they drew their children along with them. And not only do we have, Saint Therese of Lisieux as an example, but her sister is now up for canonization. Right. So we see the absolute transformation that we can have when we step into those roles as spiritual leaders, really emulate, Christ in that way, and he transforms our whole family through those small steps that we take.
Mm-hmm. Well, this struck me, and these two together seemed contradictory initially. It was like, look ahead and dream big, but focus on the present moment.
Right.
How do you put those two together?
Right. So one of the things that, when we talk about growing in our Catholic faith and becoming spiritual leaders, our ultimate goal is heaven. We all want to be saints. So that's a really big dream, especially, when I think about that, I think about how far I have to go, and that seems like a very lofty goal. So what I have to do in dreaming big and wanting to be a saint is to then turn back to the present moment and say, what can I do right in this moment to draw me closer to sainthood? And so it's those little things, like how can I sacrifice for my husband in this moment? How can I communicate with him more effectively or show him more affection or patience or whatever virtue that God's calling me to in that moment? Or how can I just be more of a servant to my children in this moment? How can I, love them and bring them closer to Jesus? My son, after Mass every morning, likes to walk the Stations of the Cross outside the church. He's a year and a half old, and when Mass is over, he cannot wait to go walk the Stations of the Cross. And there was one morning, I just remember being so hot outside. I'm pregnant with my second, and I wanted to go, and I just thought, in this moment, how beautiful is it? How important of a sacrifice is it for me to just stay out here in this heat and allow him to go from station to station, adoring Jesus and his passion.
To do that.
Right, exactly.
So, I wish he'd go with us into the station.
Right. I remember praying to God in that moment, please allow this, beautiful faith of his to continue and help to always give me the tools to usher him deeper into that relationship with Christ.
You say concentrate on your family and not on other families.
Right. In today's social media culture, I think it's so easy to, look at other people's Facebook pages or, whatever whatever's going on in other families and to say, gosh, look, they look so holy, and we're not even doing this and we're not doing that. And to be able to just say, okay, but what's God calling our family to right now? And how can we use, the witness of others to help encourage us, not demotivate us on our own unique path to sanctity?
Well, you say here, refocusing on spiritual leadership and in modern family life. In many ways, our culture encourages us to focus on all the wrong things when it comes to family life. What would be an example of wrong things?
Well, one of the things that I like to think of is how, most of us go through the education system, and what's most important as we're going through school are our math scores, or our English scores, or, that we think about all these things that we're being tested on and graded on throughout education. But our children, are we raising them to know and to understand and to see that the virtues are the most important, characteristics that they'll grow to know, that, as important as math and English skills are, how are they learning to love more? How are they learning to sacrifice? What are those other, virtues of patience and generosity that they're growing in, that we can be instilling in them, that really kind of reprioritize what our family life is really all about, that we're really about sanctity, and all of those things that our culture tells us are important. Some of them are important, but not nearly as important as becoming saints and living holy family life. And when we refocus on those characteristics that are most important, living a virtuous life in the home, practicing the sacraments, living peacefully, learning how to suffer well. When we refocus on those things, we actually become so much happier and feel like our family life is so much more meaningful and purposeful.
Well, so much of the media tends to portray that kind of piety or that kind of virtuousness as this kind of Puritanism, which is what we're talking about as Catholics, of course. Right.
Well, and I think when you read the book, like the last thing you get is Puritanism. I mean, these are just everyday Catholic families, just doing their best, raising kids. Things are difficult. There's one gentleman in the prayer chapter, Matthew, he talks about how some mornings, as much as he'd like to get up and, pray for a long time, all he has time for is the glory be. And so at least he starts his day with his thoughts and prayers to God, and then tries to work in more time, private time with the Lord throughout the day. And, and Michelle, in that same, chapter about prioritizing prayer, she talks about, how mother had taught her that it's not how necessarily, not to measure her prayer life based on how many rosaries she's said or how many hours she spent in adoration, but how much more am I able to love in this given situation than I was the last time I found myself in this place. And so, you kind of learn these things of, wow, these are just ordinary people like me, and they're struggling just like I am, but they've started coming up with their own, strategies and ways of really trying to become more of the spiritual leaders that God's calling them to be.
Now, do you have a dusty coffee table in your home? And if so, why did you bring it up?
So I actually tell the story of when my husband and I were in marriage prep. We had brought up a story that we had read in a book talking about how, who dusts the coffee table, whoever bumps into it first. And someone had said, well, I don't know about you, but I bump into a dusty coffee table and I think, man, this coffee table's dusty. My husband bumps into it and he thinks, hey, this coffee table's en route to my television and scoots right around it. So it really got my husband and I thinking about how, how do we differentiate our roles in the family, specifically when it comes to spiritual things? Whose job is it to lead prayer? Whose job is it to do all these different things, that are related to the spirituality of our family? And when I started, kind of exploring into that more, what I saw was less of a you do this and you do that, and more of a very fluid teamwork between a lot of the couples that I interviewed.
It's 100%,
capitalizing on each other's strengths.
as we like to say in marriage and Canada used to say. It's not a 50-50 thing, it's 100.
Exactly, and couples have different gifts. So, I may be the one to suggest, hey, we should pray in this scenario. But then my husband takes the opportunity to say, okay, well, I'll lead the prayer, So you just kind of take advantage of, what God gave each other as gifts in your spiritual life.
You've got a spiritual head. You talk about a portrait, attitude of surrender, humility, boldness, openness to fellowship, friendship with Saint Joseph.
Right. So one of the things I loved most about interviewing these people is to see kind of common themes of the traits that they had, that they used in their family, and the virtues they exhibited to their family, and whether or not all of these men and women really kind of displayed these characteristics to the fullest. They knew this is what they were aiming for, and so just to know, okay, like as a strong spiritual head of my family, I really need to learn how to surrender. Just like Christ, surrendered his life for his bride, the church, I need to learn how to surrender every day my life or my desires in some way for my family. Knowing what they were aiming for really helps them on a day-to-day basis, kind of live more closely to the ideal that they're trying to reach.
And then you've got portrait of a spiritual heart, a habit of sacrifice, quiet trust, reliance on grace, unseen strength and friendship with Mary. So based upon this, is it possible for the man to be the spiritual heart and the woman to be the spiritual head, or is that just not the biblical approach?
Well, that's actually one of the things that I put, it's the first chapter in the book. I talk about the unique and complementary roles of the spiritual head and spiritual heart of the family, because our culture does not like to say that there are any distinctions between the man and the woman of the family, and that our roles are interchangeable. And though we can share a lot of the virtues, like my husband is extremely humble, so even though I list that as one of the beautiful characteristics of a spiritual heart, my husband, the spiritual head of our family, definitely has that characteristic. But what I wanted to do was just make sure that people understood these roles are different, and they're different for a reason. That God gave my husband uniquely masculine gifts and me uniquely feminine gifts that he intends us to use together for the good of our family. And so my husband is, he's more responsible for overseeing the kingdom of his family, disciplining the children and seeing that they bear good fruit in the world, emulating Saint Joseph and the Heavenly Father in that way. And whereas I try to emulate the Blessed Mother in that I'm kind of the moral and spiritual provider in our home. I bring a lot of that heart relationship into the household, and I'm able to serve him as the helper fit for him that Genesis talks about as Eve being the helper fit for Adam. And so we talk about in the book, what makes us different, and then how do we use those differences for the good of our marriage and family.
That's why all the football players say hello mom when they're on TV. They never say hello dad. There's a chapter here, I just wish God didn't trust me so much.
Right. So that's actually, I believe that's in the chapter about suffering.
Right.
And my good friend Dana went through. They take up
their crosses.
Right, exactly. Right. And that particular story is about a friend of mine, Dana, who went through a lot of struggles with fertility. And she realized as she was going through this time, that God was calling she and her husband to be spiritual leaders for each other, but not necessarily spiritual leaders for children at that time. And that was really hard for her her to accept during that phase of her life. And she would often think, you know, man, I know God can't give me anything I can't handle, but I just wish he didn't trust me so much. And so she came to an understanding that if I can unite my sufferings on the cross, if I can, you know, just when I can't stand, if I can just kneel to him in prayer, then I really find so much more purpose in the suffering that he's giving us. And Randy Hain, another author and friend of Ewtn,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, in that chapter he talks about, you know, when his son was diagnosed with autism, the cross that,
yeah,
right, exactly.
On the book
yeah,
him,
yeah, it's a wonderful book. I was happy to endorse it, actually. You know, he talked about the cross being given to him of, you know, how do we handle this in our family life? What is this going to mean for our family? How do we best serve our son? You know, and how it really caused him to have to radically recalibrate, are the words he used, his mindset, and that when he was able to do that, you know, it really made him a much stronger spiritual leader in his home.
And you point out near the end, by the way of the family, this project has been transformative for us, but our work has really only just begun. I also expect that being complementary to one another, we'll likely have times when we're working on different characteristics, and that's where you talk about that as well. So you're obviously a writer, so you must have another book in the works.
Oh, I'm working on babies right now, not more books, but we'll see what God has in store in the future.
Well, thank you so much, Katie Warner.
Thank you.
Great to have you. Katie Peterson Warner.
Yes, CatholicKatie.com.
Right, exactly. There you go. Head and Heart is the title of the book, Becoming Spiritual Leaders for Your Family. It's published by Emmaus Road, available through the Ewtn Religious Catalog. Check it out. Check us out next time right here on Ewtn's Bookmark.